His future in Brooklyn, I think it's fair to say, is unclear because he has shown so far a resolve, a resistance to not apologize.
First and foremost, I'd like to thank Steve and Leela and the entire Nash family. The team was not doing what it was supposed to be doing.
We had a tough start. It was a rocky year last year, rocky summer. We knew that everybody was being evaluated.
The Brooklyn Nets, how one team never left the basement. The 2022-23 season is all but over for the Brooklyn Nets, and they haven't even played 10 games so far. An argument can be made that it was all over in the summer before it even started. The final nail in their coffin is fittingly everything surrounding Kyrie Irving, the hometown kid who orchestrated this supposed new resurgence of the team he grew up loving. Well, sort of. That team today has announced that they will suspend Irving for 5 games or until he meets criteria for return. Get this, for not apologizing because he has an opinion that doesn't agree with theirs for a post he made that probably wasn't well thought out, and realistically, and most importantly, because as a business, he hurt the team's bottom line by drawing a line in the sand he refused to erase, and if not suspending him, their business partners now and of the future would never forgive them. You heard that right. A basketball player having his best season in a long time suspended for a social media post. This comes days after firing Steve Nash after his 2-5 start, a start he was fighting in a corner by himself with his back against a wall because his biggest superstar, Kevin Durant, requested he be fired the summer before the season began. As a coach, how does one coach one player that doesn't respect you and ask the owner to let you go or else, and another that said before you even got the job that the team doesn't need you, that anyone could sit in that position because he and the other top player on the team are so good and have mastered the game so well that your position is obsolete? Steve Nash wasn't my favorite coach, but he had no chance from the start, and everyone missed that until he was eventually fired. We all lived through an entire summer where Kevin Durant, who some call the best player on the planet, overshadowed his former team, the Warriors' championship celebrated summer, winning without him as his new team he left them for was completely falling apart as he cried for 3 months to be traded, blaming everyone but himself for the team's ineptitude thus far. But who's to blame, and is it even important at this point? What matters is the Brooklyn Nets were given everything for this now 4-year plan to have worked. New ownership, new stadium, new head coach handpicked by the new superstars brought in, or should I say walked in on their own free will, meticulously planning this new joint venture to play together, all for there to be distraction after distraction, leading to the biggest team growth stunt possibly of all time. One of the best point guard ball handlers, shooters, and finishers the game has ever seen, a top 10 talent and unicorn that still hasn't been duplicated, a former 2-time MVP as coach, and all the money and influence in the world, and one playoff series win to show for it in 4 years. The Brooklyn Nets will go down as one of the biggest disappointments ever in basketball, and here are 3 reasons why. Let's talk about it. It's your boy JC Stunted Growth. Let's get it, man. Take a minute to like, subscribe, and comment on who I should do next. As you know, the Brooklyn, formerly New Jersey Nets are still part of 11 NBA teams that never won a championship. Years and years of superstars and Hall of Fame players, and still the closest they've ever gotten was the 2003 NBA Finals 4-2 loss to the Spurs. Almost 20 years later, and the team is in a much worse state than arguably it's ever been. This was supposed to have been remedied in 2019 when the game's 2 brightest superstars in Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant plotted their way into being faces of the franchise. New owner Joe Tsai opened the checkbook to fund this plot, signing anyone his 2 superstars wanted, even if they were well past their primes. He even hired a coach hand-selected by his superstars, One they felt could sit pretty in a seat labeled coach, but has no coaching experience, and without a big enough voice to challenge said superstars at anything they wanted to do. Disappointment after disappointments later, and here we are, embarking on another disappointment of a season where the Nets are for sure not winning this year and will possibly lose both KD and Kyrie in the summer, with Kyrie at his worst point stock-wise, a free agent, and being suspended by his team and attacked by the owner who were supposed to come to his defense but failed. And KD, who will force his way into the team wanting to trade him since he doesn't look like he wants to be there anyway. The Brooklyn Nets bent backwards for these two guys, and now for what? Stunt number 1, not a leader. Right off the bat, we have to start with the fact the Nets had no real leaders on their team. That to me starts with Kevin Durant. Kevin Durant has never been and has not evolved into the leader he needed to be to finally step out the second place shadows he's always been in his entire life and alluded to wanting to be freed from early on in his career. But at this point, that was just a marketing scheme for Nike to sell more shoes and for Kevin to get bigger contracts with promises he'd one day become something he doesn't have the makeup to. When has Kevin Durant been the leader on his team? Never. When has he been the best player on his team? Always. Even on a 75-win team, KD could step in and be the best player on it. But guess what? He never once became that team's leader, and secretly, I think he loved that. That's why he flourished. The smallest, most soft-spoken guy on the team was its leader because he did it time and time again by example. In OKC, they had no leaders. That's why they were what they were, KD's first failure. Russell Westbrook was the bigger personality and most electrifying, but he's no lead by example guy. KD was the most talented, but doesn't see basketball as needing to be a leader. He just wants to play. Imagine going to war, the captain of the ship is up in the war, then gets blindsided and loses the war in the end. He bends his knee to the winners and joins their ship, leaving his crew behind to sink. He proudly rides along on his new ship into 2 expected victories, where even the ship's owner says he'll never be a true part of the ship. With his feelings hurt, he leaves the ship to captain his own. Except he brings on another captain because he's not willing to take on the challenge of being the captain any longer. That captain hasn't learned how to captain either, and so the ship sinks with both captains at odds on each side, secretly blaming the other. The Brooklyn Nets failed because Kevin Durant was not the leader they hoped they were getting, along with stunt number 2, Cheddar Bob, Kyrie Irving. Because Kyrie Irving failed to remove himself out of his own way for the greater good of team success. Cheddar Bob was a character from the movie 8 Mile that wanted to be something he's clearly not. When in position of power and a moment to prove himself, what does he do? Shoots himself in the private area, almost ending his life. Kyrie Irving reminds me of that, where he thinks he's the brightest in the room but doesn't do the research enough to claim that. So he constantly puts his own foot in his mouth, like when he forced his way out of Cleveland from under a real leader in LeBron James, thinking he could be the face of a franchise. He was granted that franchise and failed miserably in that role, eventually stepping on everything that franchise stands for on his way out. From sideways attacking his own young teammates to promising to return and pouting, Kyrie in Boston was a shipwreck. In Brooklyn, it was even worse. A distraction since the beginning, from taking time off without notifying anyone, injury, unvaccinated, even though the entire team did so they could win, last chance year, and the first 10 games he's already suspended, even though I think uncalled for, and an attack by the media Kyrie once called peons. Kyrie's career, mostly in Brooklyn, was an all-time talented one, overshadowed by him putting himself more and more over the team and crashing because of it. Top 75 talent, no way Damian Lillard had a better career, but he shot himself in the Stunt number 3, coaching and front office. Not to be left without blame, Joe Tsai, Steve Nash, and Sean Marks all failed this team just as much as Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. Their first mistake was giving those two so much power and never checking them when they said things like, "We don't need a coach. Either of us can coach." Well, ask the Celtics if they needed a coach to perfectly create a scheme that completely took Kyrie out of the series since Game 1 of the 2022 playoffs and made Kevin Durant look like a rookie for 4 straight games. None of those supposed leaders had enough respect for them that they could step in and challenge their stars who didn't have the wherewithal to see they were misleading themselves. Then they fire Steve Nash, who deserved it at the end of the day, probably will fire Sean Marks eventually, and continue on losing like they've done since their existence. All in all, I've never seen a team this talented and deep. Let's not forget they had James Harden for a while also, and never won more than a first-round series. Truly the biggest team disappointment of all time, if you ask me. Even now, I still don't think KD and Kyrie understand it was all because of them. Where do they go going forward? Another decade of losing until they get real leadership and talent on all fronts. Salute, it's your boy JC Stunted Growth, and I'm out.